our next guest was just 22 years old when she witnessed her first execution at a Texas prison.
So, having spent 12 years reporting on the final moments of inmates on death row, Michelle Lyons saw almost 300 men and women die by lethal injection.
And after putting all her experiences into a book, Michelle joins us now to tell her story. Good morning, Michelle.
Morning, Michelle.
Hi, good morning. Good morning.
This is absolutely fascinating. You've wrote this book. It's called Death Row, The Final Minutes. What made you want to do this book? Was it the fact that you saw so much and you needed therapy, really, just to get it out? Was that the main reason of writing the book?
Yeah, I'll be honest. For every execution that I witnessed, and especially as being a journalist, I would take all of these notes. And so when I left, truly, I had files and files of notes. They're actually in this red file cabinet that's behind me. Yeah. And so when I left in 2012, I would find that, especially when I would be driving, because my new job was an hour and a half away, I had all of this time to really kind of reflect on everything that I had seen. And it was very discombobulated. I would picture faces and I would picture last words and I would picture, family members and such, but I couldn't really put it together in a very cohesive way. And so working on the book was really very cathartic because it forced me to go through these files and really remember it and put it all back in an order that I could make sense of and really move past it.
Sure. So, Michelle, let's go back to the start. How did you end up working on death row and reporting about it?
So I was a reporter at the Huntsville Item in Huntsville, Texas, which is where the death chamber is located. And so as the prison reporter in Huntsville, you have a seat at every execution. So when I took the job, I knew that that was a role that I would take. But in any given year up until that time, there would maybe be 10 executions in a year. So in my mind, maybe I'll witness 10 executions. Well, in that first year in 2000, there were 40 executions in Texas that year, which is something that no one could ever have predicted. And so that first year, and at that time I was 24, and I had witnessed one a couple of years previously. It was just a massive number in such a small amount of time. Yeah. But that's how I started.
So when you saw your first execution, age 22, did it have an effect on you? Or, I can imagine that would have a massive...
Sure. To
see someone be killed in front of you, that must have had a massive effect on you, Michelle.
The thing is that at that time, especially I think because I was so, when you're young, you don't know very much about life and death and such. And here I'm a young journalist and I'm trying really hard to prove my worth and prove that I'm good at this job. So I was very good about compartmentalizing, going in there, watching it, leaving and saying, this doesn't impact me. It truly was later on after I became a parent that I really began to have a much more difficult time with it, because that's when I really considered not only what the victim's family was going through, which I had always considered, but truly what the inmate's family was going through. Because, here you have a woman who's watching her child die in front of her. And that's when I especially started really struggling with it. It wasn't when I was younger, it was as I got older and knew more about life and especially how fragile it was.
Of course. How did your life work on a day-to-day basis? So, just briefly give us an outline as to you'd get there and you'd spend time with the inmate. Would that be right?
Yeah, on the day of an execution, I would usually see them in the hours prior to the execution. So I would usually see them 4 or 5 hours before. And that also is something that was complicated. I started as a reporter at the Huntsville Item, but in 2001, I left to become the spokesperson for the Texas prison system. And so in that role, I got to know the inmates much more closely, or I got to spend a lot more time with them because I was then the person facilitating the interviews with them. So I was seeing them week after week after week. And so then to see them in the hours before they're being executed sometimes was difficult. There were, some inmates who their crimes were such that it's not that I disagreed with the punishment, but then there were others that I struggled with because it's not whether or not the punishment was deserved or any, it was not getting into that, but it was that I truly felt if I were on that jury, I don't know that I would have given them the death penalty, or could this person be redeemed?
So could you explain, can you give us like a visual picture of what actually happened in the final, say, 30 minutes of someone about to be executed? Where are you sitting? Where's their families? Where's the victims' families? What, can you just outline a picture for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think everybody has this picture of what they see in movies, that there's this big room and there's chairs and everything. And it's not set up that way. Truly, there is a tiny room that has an execution gurney in it. And when the witnesses are brought in, they the inmate is already on the gurney and the IV lines are already established. So the public does not ever see any of that take place. But there are two witnessing rooms that are side by side, and the victim's family is in one room, the inmate's family is in the other room, and then the media witnesses are dispersed in between those two rooms. And that was my role, really, was to bring those media witnesses in so they could report on everything. But in those final moments, the inmate was given an opportunity to make a last statement, and that's where really things could change. Everything else was very regimented. Everything else went like clockwork. But in those last statements, that's when sometimes they would apologize. They would apologize to the victim's family for what they had done, or they would apologize to their families for putting them through that. Some would profess their innocence, and then you had some that were very angry and would make very, very ugly statements.
I guess that must have been the strangest, like you said. Up to then, everything is kind of goes by the book, but you have these moments of like anything from anger to serenity, I guess.
It's true. And at that point, you really don't know what's going to happen. When I would go and see them in those hours before the execution, my role really was to kind of see what their demeanor was, because that's what the reporters would ask me. How was he when you saw him? And I could say, he was very quiet, or in some cases, honestly, they were looking forward to it. One of the cases that I will not forget is a man who was a biker. He rode motorcycles when he was younger and when he was free. And for him, he looked forward to the execution because it was a type of release. And so his last statement was spent really saying, I'm free, I'm getting out of here. And he quoted the lyrics to a song called "The Road Goes On Forever and the Party Never Ends." And so that's when you really could not predict what was going to come in that last statement.
And with lethal injection, sorry to be so graphic, but do you think it's painless when they have that? Because I would have thought that it would have been quite a night. It'd be like having an operation and just falling to sleep.
Now Texas uses a 1-drug method, which I never witnessed. At the time that I witnessed, it was a 3-drug method. And, in my view, certainly of the almost 300 executions I saw, never once did I see an inmate who expressed there was no expression of pain. The only references that I ever saw to any type of sensation with the chemicals were a couple of inmates who said that they could taste it. And one specifically saying, I can taste it and it tastes nasty. So no, the first chemical that was delivered was a lethal sedative. And so really it put the inmate to sleep. As you said, it almost like a surgery before the other two chemicals actually took effect.
Michelle, how do you feel about the death penalty now? Obviously, culturally, our two countries are very different in regards to this. And I suppose Texas is an extreme example of America. But how do you feel about the death penalty now? Are you, having seen 300 executions, do you still support it? Or do you feel in certain cases, or where's your head at?
I think it's such a complex issue. When I was there, what pulled at me was that I just wanted people to see both sides of the argument, because I had to see both sides. I saw the pain that the victims' families went through in having someone they loved taken from them. But I also saw the pain that the inmates' families went through, because they also had nothing to do with this crime. And again, these women are watching their child die. For me, it really is such a case-by-case basis. You have crimes where you have an individual who has, murdered a child, you have serial killers and such. And I don't see the redemption there. I think in Texas, especially during the time that I was witnessing executions, that it was overused. A lot of that has been alleviated because since Texas has introduced life without parole. So really drastically, the population on Texas death row has dropped. But that being said, I do think that there's some serious problems with the way that the death penalty is imposed. I think that there's a real problem with the access to DNA testing. I do not think that an inmate should have to jump through so many hoops in the court system just to get DNA tested. To me, whether you support the death penalty or you're against it, you should want to make absolutely sure that the person who's being punished committed that crime. And that should not, include someone having to go to court for 3 or 5 years just to get that DNA test.
Michelle, it's fascinating talking to you. I think we could talk to you for hours.
Thank you.
Listen, good luck with the book.
Thank you.
Michelle's book,
Thank
Death
you.
Row, The Final Minutes, is out now. Thank you, Michelle Lyons.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you.